Did you know that in 1981, the world's first personal computer was released by IBM? Now, before that, computers were kind of big enough to fill an entire room, and you only really found them in places like universities and large businesses. In fact, the first computer ever to arrive went to Rhodes University. But the personal computer was not the only first in 1981, because NASA launched their first space shuttle in 1981. The United States not only declared their very first diagnosis of AIDS, but also had their very first female Supreme Court justice. I'm told those two events are unrelated. Elsewhere, some dodgy folk tried to assassinate Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II, and then some slightly more skilled dodgy folk succeeded in assassinating the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat. And if that wasn't enough hits for the year, MTV was also launched in August of 1981. And for those of you who are wanting to stretch your mental trivia, I won't tell you the name now, but I will at the end of the video reveal the very first music video ever played on MTV. Now, we're talking about 1981 because in that same year, a very special vineyard was planted in the Swartland down on the southern end of the African continent. And it was this vineyard that produced the fruit for today's hand drink solo wine of the day, which is the RAAR Skin Contact Chenin Blanc, made by the supremely talented Cherie Nothnagel. The RAAR Skin Contact Chenin Blanc is produced by the Riebeek Wine Company, which is a very large co-op who is supremely proud to work almost exclusively with Swartland fruit, which they bring in from the surrounding Swartland grape farmers. In South Africa, the cooperatives often get a bad rap, sometimes correctly, for tarnishing the international reputation of South African wine by flooding the market with underpriced, low-quality bulk wine. But an element of the story that doesn't get told enough is that it's also these co-ops, especially the more forward-thinking ones, that are responsible for the preservation of many of our certified heritage vineyards or old vines, and for importing and cultivating some financially risky experimental cultivars. In fact, in a weird way, I guess we could say that we owe much of the variety and rich heritage that the South African winelands has to some of these co-ops like the Riebeek Wine Company, even if that variety and heritage is sometimes funded by underpriced bulk wine. Oh, what a tangled web we weave! As I've mentioned in other videos, the RAAR range is a small batch artisanal geeky range of wines made by Cherie Nothnagel. But when I say these wines are geeky, I don't mean that they taste so weird that you can't get any enjoyment out of them unless you have a degree in organic chem.
That would be ridiculous.
Cherie is able to take these wines and present them in supremely accessible fashion and make them delicious before they're intellectually stimulating. But they do manage to be that second part as well. This is something that not all our geekier winemakers get right. Now, if you've been in the Hand Drink Solo Wine Club for a while, you will no doubt have already experienced Cherie's really delicious award-winning Grenache Blanc. But the fun doesn't stop there, because she also makes a carbonic maceration Syrah, there's an old vine Palomino, there's a Petit Syrah or Durif, and of course there's today's Skin Contact Chenin Blanc from the Swartland. Now, when we finally get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, well, your first thought may be, hey, Han, I thought this was a skin contact wine, but I'm not getting any of those smoky, savory, phenolic elements. And instead, what we're getting is these warm, comforting notes of baked yellow apple, perhaps some vanilla and cinnamon pie crust. There's even a touch of toffee sauce drizzled over the top. It really is quite delicious. And then, just in case you think it's all devolving into dessert, there's also a kind of slightly more savory hint of sourdough, which, just to keep the mystique up. Now, as I mentioned, that list of flavor notes is supremely inviting compared to what you might get on some of the wilder skin ferment wines. And that's because this is not a skin ferment wine. It's a skin contact wine that has between 3 and 10 days of maceration time, cold soak time before fermentation. So the grapes sit on their own juice for, as I say, between 3 and 10 days, but it's kept very cold. so there's no fermentation that is allowed to kick off. This cold soak process has a far more gentle extraction nature, really, because when grapes do ferment, they warm up, there's convection as a result of that warming up, there's also alcohol, which is a better solvent, and so you end up extracting all these smoky, savory, waxy, sometimes shoe polishy elements into the wine. But cold soak doesn't do any of that. And yet, because you have a long time of juice and skins together, you do get the gentle extraction of more texture and complexity. It's just not as wild or as savory. When we give this guy a sip, well, the palate really is every bit as inviting as the nose, except now we can add in that with all those desserty toffee sauce and cinnamon and nutmeg and pie crust and baked yellow apple, there's also some really impressive juicy acidity that comes in the sort of form of a tart apricot note, some fresh peach, and even a touch of ripe citrus. I guess if I were to use an analogy, this is kind of like John Mayer in a bottle, because it's refined and silky and a massive crowd pleaser, but it is also way nerdy enough in order to send the wine geeks into their own little realm of spasm. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. And if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon to help us make more of these sorts of videos. And subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos every month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, unusual winemaking techniques, and some of the dynamic winemakers, like Chenin Nagel, to be coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.